Tonight we go behind closed doors to visit cloistered nuns.
And discuss life and death with a world-famous brain surgeon.
We'll look in on the restoration of the Last Supper.
And Mike Gallagher reviews a movie about Pope John Paul II.
Hello, I'm Sean Hughescamp.
And I am Monsignor Charles Minor. Welcome to this edition of Reel to Reel. Palm Sunday, Holy Week, and Easter are the events which Christians celebrate throughout the world. But they're not merely events that we celebrate, but actually we recall the experiences of the interior life of the Christian.
Reel to Reel had the rare experience of going beyond the grill and into the cloister enclosure of 4 out of the 6 contemplative monasteries in the Philadelphia area. We took a look at the daily lives of these sisters, and we talked to them to discover what kind of women choose this silent life. What paths were their lives taking before their decision for religious life, and how did their parents react to their choice? In this continuing series, you will meet sisters from the Poor Clares in Langhorne, the Pink Sisters in Center City, Sisters of the Visitation on City Avenue, and Sisters of Jesus Crucified in Devon, who, by the way, welcome healthy and handicapped women into their order.
Your goodness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall declare your praise.
The day begins with prayer.
You take no delight. Burnt offerings from me you will refuse. My sacrifice and contrite spirit, how contrite heart you will not spare.
One half of the sisters' waking hours is devoted to prayer, time that is spent in the chapel at the celebration of the Mass.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Reciting the Divine Office. Spiritual readings at mealtime.
A permanent delegate to the Holy See. I do not understand it all. There is mystery and confusion, and that naturally follows.
Hourly adoration before the exposed Eucharist. And quiet, personal, reflective moments. Each day, year after year, these women take upon themselves the awesome responsibility of praying for all the people in the world. Soldiers killed in Beirut, a lost child, a grandmother dying of cancer, the Pope, the President, an unemployed father, a mother nervous about childbirth. No one is excluded, and yet the very world these women pray for is excluded from their world. In some countries, cloistered nuns were at one time referred to as women who were buried alive. But being closed off by walls is not necessarily the same as being closed off in heart and mind.
Sister, why did you choose the contemplative life as opposed to the active religious life?
I felt it was the lifestyle in which I could most fully serve the Lord in His church, to be the more totally committed. And then also I had a great attraction for the life and a great desire for it, which to me were indications that it was God's will for me.
Sean, I thought of active religious life from the time I was in second grade. And when I finished high school, I would have entered an active order because I very much admired the teachers that I had. And the family needed my help financially at that time, so I went to work for 4 years. During the course of that time, Merton's books came out, and he was all the rage. And in reading one of those, I came across a line that said, religious life has to mean sacrifice. For me, entering an active group wouldn't have been a sacrifice. And I felt very much, I tried to get that sentence out of my head, it wouldn't go. And finally, it dawned on me the Lord was calling me to something else.
I think it's more accurate to say that I didn't choose it at all, but God chose it for me because I was really afraid enough of nuns, any kind of nuns in the first place, and then contemplative nuns, I didn't even think they existed in this country. I thought they were somewhere in Europe, some small town in Europe only. I had it all planned differently. I was going to be a career woman, and I was going to have my own apartment, and I even had the furniture selected, and I was going to travel a lot, and I was going to be very independent.
What was your life like before you entered the cloister?
I guess pretty normal because I had the usual parties and dates, and I had been a professional dancer.
I was a nurse.
I was a switchboard operator at Niagara Auto Parts.
Worked for a public utility in the advertising department.
First I was a copy editor, and then I was a reprint editor.
I had a beautiful married life, a good husband, and beautiful, unselfish children, and also a good job at a good hospital.
Does the seclusion here ever bother you?
Not me. No, I always felt a certain attraction towards seclusion and solitary. And anyway, we're not exactly, we live in community, even though we're, certain solitude, but the community life is very strong. So that actually sometimes you feel like you have to get away from community for solitude.
Occasionally, but not that often. It's mostly when the weather's real nice. I'd like to get on a bicycle and take a ride through the country or so, but that's about the only time.
At one time it did, because I love people, and I like to meet people, and...
Never. This is what I wanted. That's what I came here for. I am never alone. I am always with God.
What were your parents' reaction to your decision to enter a cloister?
Well, they thought it was just another phase, a growing phase, and that, that too would end.
My father was simply opposed to the whole idea of religious life, and we struggled with it quite a lot.
They really didn't understand it. They didn't understand the life and why I would want to do something like that, since I had a very full life, as it was. But they came to understand it after a while.
What do you think your life would have been like if you hadn't entered the cloister?
I think I've been very happy. I think because my parents' marriage is an ideal marriage. I saw that, and I was surrounded by friends who were good and happy, and I had a friend that I was thinking of marrying, and so I feel that I would have had the same kind of marriage, and In other words, I didn't escape to the cloister.
Well, I wanted to be a fashion designer at one point, and I wanted to get married and have about 10 kids.
You know, I thought of getting married up to 6 months before entering the cloister.
Probably back then, I guess I would have married. Looking at it today, I think I would have traveled and dabbled in a lot of different types of careers. Interesting, I think.
Watch next month for the second part of our series on cloistered nuns, where they tell us what they like most about their life, they talk about their regrets, and they tell us why they truly believe that their prayers are for the whole world.
There's more to come on Reel to Reel. Stay tuned for Mike Gallagher and The Last Supper. Coming up in Arts Review, Mike Gallagher previews for us one of the Easter specials offered by CBS. It is a TV movie based on the life of Pope John Paul II. Then, continuing in the Eastertide spirit, we'll look in on the restoration of an artistic treasure. It was created centuries ago, and though abused and neglected, it remains a symbol of faith and an example of classic art. I'm talking about the Leonardo da Vinci Last Supper.
Hello, I'm Mike Gallagher. This week I'm going to take a look at a special worth seeing this Easter. CBS's Pope John Paul II starring Albert Finney. It'll be broadcast from 8 to 11 p.m. The times that Karol Wojtyła lived through as a youth, as a seminarian, as a young priest, and as the Archbishop of Krakow were extraordinary ones. A time of great tragedy for his native land and for all of Europe. A time also of spiritual triumph in the face of the harshest oppression known to modern history. Pope John Paul II begins in September of 1978 with the sudden death of John Paul I, who occupied the papal throne for only 33 days. As the Archbishop of Krakow, Finney, shocked and saddened, prepares to leave for Rome for the conclave, he sees some boys playing soccer outside his window, and he thinks of his own youth on the eve of World War II. From then on, director Herbert Weiss weaves splashbacks into a narration dealing with the events leading immediately to the papal election. We see the young Karol Wojtyła, played by Michael Crompton, as a student intensely interested in dramatics, but drawn towards the priesthood. In the midst of the terror of the occupation, he works in a quarry and helps in the perilous work of saving Jews from the Nazis. It is at this time that he makes his decision to become a priest and begins his seminary studies under conditions of great hardship. Then, when the liberators of Poland turn out to be the Russians, a new and different struggle begins, one between the church and a militant atheism triumphant. But the church in Poland is not without power of its own, and Karol Wojtyła, as he rises in authority, plays a larger and larger role in this drama in which the soul of a nation is at stake.
I come from a church which has suffered much for the faith. I have been part of that suffering. Now you ask me to accept even greater suffering as supreme pastor of that church. They are Poles. And Poles have been in the church's hands for 1,000 years before communism.
Not everything works equally well in Pope John Paul II. The portions of the story closer to the present are the more effective ones, helped greatly by Finney's presence and by the fact that more is on record and less is left to the imagination of writer Christopher Knopf. Knopf seems to lack dramatic flair. And I'm also inclined to doubt that the Pope ever played Petruchio in The Taming of the Shrew, though there are American nuns, I'm sure, who will readily accept it. Weiss's direction, however, and some excellent acting make up for the incidental flaws. I recommend this television film highly, especially to young people and to those of us who might be less familiar than we should be with the momentous events that have had such an effect upon the man who now sits on the throne of St. Peter's. I'm Mike Gallagher for Arts Review.
For centuries, artists have been depicting the Last Supper. But most people don't realize the most famous version was painted on a dining room wall in Milan by Leonardo da Vinci. David Brown, Renaissance curator at the National Gallery of Art, is an expert on Leonardo and his work.
Earlier artists had represented the theme of the institution of the Eucharist. Leonardo evidently felt that this theme was not sufficiently dramatic, and he chose instead to represent the moment of the announcement of the betrayal and the astonished and varied reactions of the apostles to Christ's terrible words.
Where other artists had represented Christ and the apostles as isolated figures, Leonardo arranged the 12 in groups of 3 so that they related not only to Christ, but to each other.
There are reasons for the apostles being together. In some cases, it's contrast, as between the tranquil St. John and the impetuous Peter. Or apostles are together because they were martyred together, like Thaddeus and Simon at the right end of the mural. Leonardo thought everything through very carefully.
Within Leonardo's lifetime, the masterpiece began to disintegrate.
The problem initially began with Leonardo because he painted on the wall as if it were a wood panel, and as a result the preparation underlying his pigment came loose, and this had to be secured. Persistent dampness had its effect on the painting. Later restorers repainted it several times and removed the work of their predecessors. And worst of all, probably, was the bombardment of April 15, 1943, when the refectory in which the Last Supper was painted was very nearly destroyed. Fortunately, the Last Supper had been sandbagged as a precaution, and it survived this bombardment. But it remained more or less exposed in this condition for over a year.
Presumed to be a complete loss, artists from the 16th century on simply repainted the mural, often changing details in the process. A current restoration will strip away layers of dirt, pollution, and repaint to reveal what is left of Leonardo's original painting. A special exhibition at the National Gallery of Art in Washington features a life-size photograph of the mural taken during the restoration. The restored areas reveal surprisingly brilliant colors. Another part of the exhibit includes a collection of Leonardo's original sketches, an important part of the restoration process.
These are fascinating evidence of what Leonardo's intentions were, because in many cases the sketches correspond exactly to the figures in the painting. And they give us an idea of what Leonardo meant the figures to look like.
In 3 or 4 years, the final stage of the restoration will reveal the face of Christ. Then the world will be able to see Leonardo's original masterpiece.
I've been everywhere, I've met everyone, I've done everything, and yet I haven't felt that it was necessary for me to throw the Baltimore Catechism out of the Concord at 56,000 feet.
This is the appropriate season to talk about life, death, and resurrection in classic and religious terms. Our next story shows us that the modern world has added complications to these simple questions.
The building he works in reaches for the sky, but it is neither church nor cathedral. And though he attends Mass every day and ministers to the sick and comforts families in time of crisis, he is not a priest. He has talked to the popes in Rome about what life is and death, but he's not a theologian. He's Dr. Robert J. White, director of the Division of Neurosurgery and the Brain Research Laboratory at Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital, a man who has earned an international reputation for his pioneering work in that complex, mysterious piece of human machinery called the brain.
It seems to me we would almost have to admit, I think, what constitutes human existence, what separates us from lower species, what indeed separates us from each other, what gives us that absolute uniqueness which is human, must be in the brain.
And because the brain is so central in our efforts to understand what life is, Dr. White's work has led him to re-examine the old definitions of death. 100 or even 50 years ago, the line separating life and death was reasonably clear. If your heart could no longer beat on its own, if your lungs could no longer draw breath, death followed swiftly and was easy to verify. But today, with advances in our understanding of the brain, and with the introduction of new surgical techniques and sophisticated life support systems, we have had to redefine exactly what we mean by death.
Medical science is very comfortable at the present time with the concept that when it or we have no capacity of resuscitating the brain, then we determine a patient, both legally and medically, as being brain dead. So in a sense, human death has now come down to a single organ.
The ethical, moral, and legal implications of this new concept of death did not go unnoticed in the Vatican. Among those who were most interested was Pope Paul VI.
My initial involvement was simply a request while I was in Italy to come and see him. I found myself on a Saturday noon being conducted to the Vatican apartments and was brought in and sat down with Paul VI. And while most of the time I've argued that he was asking to see me and to discuss with me the concept of brain death, I think also he was very much interested in the experiments we were doing at that time, when we could remove the brain of the animal and keep it alive with just machinery, which he certainly found interesting and fascinating. I don't think he commented one way or the other on it, but he soon moved into asking me to review medical thinking in this country on the concept of brain death.
Other visits to the Vatican followed, most recently with Pope John Paul II, where discussions centered on the emerging field of bioethics and questions about how we ought to make the difficult life and death decisions demanded in a world of liver transplants and artificial hearts.
I think it's going to become, and in fact is already, the greatest moral dilemma in medical practice in this country, because it asks the question, can we any longer provide super health care, critical care, intensive care for everyone in this country? There's no question that we're up against a problem in providing appropriate and excellent care for the poor and the aged. I don't see how we can go on funding that, which we're not doing adequately now, and go around providing heart, lung, pancreas, transplantations, and indeed even artificial hearts for everyone.
But while these questions are being debated in the Vatican and elsewhere, Dr. White and others like him must get on with all the tasks, large and small, required of a practicing surgeon.
It's going much better.
Well, how many days is it since you had your brain operation, Irma?
2 weeks and 1 day.
2 weeks and 1 day.
Right.
We had tried to manage it with just some medicine.
And there is always a special joy when a patient seems to have made a complete recovery.
How about the loss of the hair? I mean, the thing is, did that bother you?
Not a bit.
Not a bit.
I always say it's the most beautiful haircut I ever had in my life.
Dr. White has witnessed many recoveries over the course of his long career. But has he ever seen what might be called a miraculous recovery? Dr. White isn't sure.
I think I have had personal cases in which the recovery of the patient could be labeled extraordinary. But on the other hand, I never could attribute it to a miraculous event. But I have seen people who have done far better than anybody would have prognosticated. Maybe that is a reflection of some intervention by divine providence. I don't know.
But if there is any single source of strength that Dr. White can count on as he continues to explore those shady areas between life and death, it is his faith.
I represent, I guess, the old type of Catholic. I often speak of this as the Baltimore Catechism Catholic. I mean, I was put together in some way or other and rewired by nuns and priests. And I've been everywhere, I've met everyone, I've done everything, and yet I haven't felt that it was necessary for me to throw the Baltimore Catechism out of the Concord at 56,000 feet.
And how does a man who has looked so deeply at the event we call death regard the prospect that someday it will happen to him?
Well, I don't understand death, and I don't think anyone else does. The absolute dramatic difference between a living, functioning human being and one who is now dead is without explanation. I still see it as a very frightening and a very disturbing prospect, but convinced as I am of the life beyond, then I gather, like most religious, God-fearing people, it makes it easier for me to deal with it.
So many of us are concerned about the moment that life begins, and yet Dr. Wyatt has the difficulty of discovering when does death set in. But life to death, we must all of us remember, especially this week, that we are in the process of going from life to death to resurrection.
Next week, we'll go behind the scenes of a play based on Mark's Gospel.
And meet an artist who paints and aids street people.
We'll have a meditation on the 7 last words.
And the story of a Philadelphia choir that is bound for Europe. We hope you and your family enjoyed today, Palm Sunday, and look forward to much happiness come this Easter. And so tonight, goodbye and God bless you.
See you next week. Good night.